In my last video, I talked a little bit about PTSD, and I just wanted to give you guys a general understanding of what it was, where it comes from, and some of the symptoms that are involved with it. So if you missed that video, please go back and watch it. But in that video, I did mention that certain people will go through very traumatic events in their life. They'll have traumatic childhoods, they'll have traumatic experiences even as adults, and even though they go through these things, they never actually develop PTSD. One of the reasons that this might be happening is because they have figured out, either through therapy or just through their friends and family and the support that they have, they will figure out how to, in a healthy way, process their trauma and to move on, right? To actually find growth and encouragement past their trauma. However, there's an even larger group of people who will never learn how to, in a healthy way, process their trauma, but instead, in a very unhealthy way, they're going to develop coping mechanisms that enable them to, instead of moving on from their trauma, simply ignore it. This would be me. So I went to 2 combat deployments, one in 2010. I did the push into Marja City in Afghanistan with my unit, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, and it was actually the second biggest invasion that was in the Middle East, the first being the push into Fallujah, Iraq. But during this deployment, I experienced a lot of traumatic things. I ended up in my first firefight, I saw my buddy Green get shot 4 times in the back. My second firefight, I actually got shot in the body armor, so thank God it didn't hurt me or destroy me in any way. But I also, and then my 3rd firefight, we accidentally killed 2 teenagers, right? So I did see traumatic things, I had traumatic things happening around me, but I never got PTSD, and I didn't really understand why. So after years of reflecting on this, I've kind of boiled it down to 3 basic methods that I used, and I feel like they're very common for people to use to ignore their trauma and to not actually process it, but to kind of just leave it in the past, to pretend like it's not bothering them in such a way where they actually can move on. Their PTSD never develops, but these coping mechanisms, the cure that they are developing might be just as bad, if not in some cases worse than the disease itself. So let's talk about them. The first one that we can utilize is distracting ourselves. All right, so this was very common. It's usually the first one that we turn to. So after something traumatic or bad or hurtful happens to us, we just try to distract ourselves. So we go on the computer, we go on social media, we're trying our hardest just not to think about this horrible thing that's impacting us, right? I find that with teenagers, this is really prevalent and really obvious, right? So when you sit down with a teenager and you try to talk to them about something that they find awkward or horrible, you'll see them usually gravitate towards their phone or some sort of a screen. And the reason why they're doing that is because they don't want to think about what you're talking about. They want to block it out. They want to ignore what you're saying. So maybe you turn to work, maybe you turn to relationships, or maybe you turn to something more negative. Some people utilize drugs or alcohol to supplement this ability to distract themselves from their pain, or even sexual relationships in order to do this. And depending on how you're distracting yourself, this method could be more or less destructive to you and the ones around you. That wasn't really the predominant one that I used, although I did use it, and I still do. I still do try to distract myself from negative things, negative thoughts, negative feelings, that sort of thing. The second method is more common for me. This is the one that I used. And it's basically utilizing apathy. So it's trying to convince yourself that you don't care, right? You don't care about what happened to you. You don't care about what you've been through. It doesn't matter, right? That's what you're trying to convince yourself of. So when I got back from my first deployment, I went through a psych eval. And during the psych eval, the psychiatrist I sat down with, she tried to walk me through the traumatic memories that I had from my first deployment. And she did this with all my friends to see if we had PTSD. And she noticed that when she was walking me through these memories, I didn't have any emotional response. None whatsoever, which is odd. Even for someone who has had a positive coping, not positive coping, but positive processing of these memories, they'll still have some amount of emotional reaction to what they're talking about. I had none. Right? And so when she was walking me through these memories, she said, well, how do you process memories? Like, what is a memory like for you? And I said, and I told her the truth. I said, when I'm remembering things, First of all, my memory's terrible. I usually don't remember events very well, and if I do remember an event, I feel like it's happening to somebody else. I don't really feel like I'm in the memory. I don't really feel like it's happening to me. I feel disassociated from it. And she said, well, that's very common for people who have dissociative personality disorder. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, dissociative personality disorder is a disorder in which somebody is able to naturally disassociate themselves from any and all emotion from bad memories. And she said the people who are able to do this more than others are the people who are on a negative side of the spectrum when it comes to some of the more negative things that we talk about in our culture, like sociopathic tendencies and things like that. So I'm on kind of more of a negative side of that spectrum. And she said that gives you the ability to not be traumatized, but it also has a lot of negative consequences and side effects to it. I'll just give you guys a couple here, and in future videos I'll talk more about these negative consequences. But one of the big ones is that she said you're not going to be able to have compassion or empathy from other people. The reason is because you've never actually dealt with these emotions. You've found ways to ignore them, right? So whenever I'm talking to someone about something traumatic or something horrible that they've been through, and they use phrases like, well, it is what it is, stuff happens, it's no big deal, right? I've become very accustomed to hearing these kind of things because this is how I talk, and I realize that when I say things like this, I'm actually trying to convince myself more than anyone else. I'm trying to convince myself that these things really don't bother me. But here's the deal. Saying something doesn't bother you doesn't mean it actually doesn't bother you. Right? These things might still be impacting you in many ways, and you just don't even know it because maybe you've been so convincing to yourself that you've actually tricked yourself into thinking that these things don't matter, when in reality they very much do matter to you, and they are impacting you, but in more insidious ways now, ways that are underneath the surface, ways that you can't really see or measure or evaluate because you're convincing yourself that these things don't bother you. Right? Very negative coping mechanism, but one that I developed. The majority of people, though, when they try to use this coping mechanism, it won't be 100% successful. They'll be able to shut out some, but they won't be able to shut out all. And because of that, it kind of instead works like a time bomb. And I saw this happen with actually some of my buddies, where they tried to do it, but over time, their PTSD still settled in. It just bought them a couple months or maybe a couple years of time before their PTSD symptoms actually settled in. So it's kind of like putting a heavy lid on a boiling pot. It gives some relief, but not enough to actually get rid of it. The final coping mechanism that I'll mention, and it's usually the last one we turn to, is anger. All right, the reason why we use anger is because these more negative emotions that we're trying to turn off, fear, sadness, regret, guilt, shame, loss, these more negative emotions make you feel helpless. They make you feel like there's nothing you can do. But anger kind of puts you in the driver's seat. It makes you feel like you're in control, right? And that's the thing that you're trying to fight against. That's why it's called post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That feeling of stress makes you just feel like the world is happening around you, like you have no control over your actions or anyone else's. It's a terrible, terrible feeling. Anger can actually make you feel like you have some semblance of control in your life. So let me use this as an example. Let's say somebody just broke up with their very long-term boyfriend, girlfriend, something like that, and you're sitting down, you're trying to console them. Maybe the first time you talk to them, they'll say things to you like, it is what it is, like they left me, but hey, it happens to everybody, there's plenty of fish in the sea. They'll say things like that to try to convince themselves that the relationship didn't mean much to them, so they don't really miss it. But then the next time you talk to them, maybe they'll say things like, man, I dodged a bullet. That person is horrible. I didn't realize what a horrible, wicked person they are until now that I have space from them. I could see the deception and the lies. And they'll start going over all the horrible things that this person did to them in the relationship. The reason why they're doing this is because they're trying to convince themselves they didn't leave me, I left them. Right? I don't want to think about those negative thoughts that I lost this relationship, that I really loved this person, that I have a lot of regret about the way the relationship went. Instead, I just want to think like, no, it was my decision. This person I'm better off without them, and so on and so forth. Right? So in my life, that's what I did. I tried to produce a lot of anger. I tried to cultivate anger in my life, anger over the things that had happened to me, anger over the people that I blamed, anger over basically everybody in my life, in order to convince myself that these things in the past didn't happen to me, but I was in control. I was the one, I wasn't helpless, I was the person that was actually enacting all these things, right? And my anger did serve that purpose. I didn't get PTSD because of my apathy and my anger working together. However, I became a very negative person to be around. I became someone who's sarcastic, someone who didn't care, someone who just got angry at the flip of a switch. I became like violently angry around people. I was not a very pleasant person to be around, albeit I didn't have PTSD. So again, these methods, they can save you from the PTSD, but they produce something that might be even worse. And until we can learn how to properly process the things that we've gone through, these negative coping mechanisms will be very destructive within our lives. So in the next videos, I'll talk a little bit more about how these negative coping mechanisms can be destructive. But for now, I just want to leave you guys with this, that even if you have developed some of these coping mechanisms, and even if you are seeing some sort of a victory in your life as a result of them, I'm not asking you to do it right now, but just begin to consider what it would be like to let go of these coping mechanisms, to instead of distracting yourself or seeking to not care about something or becoming angry about something, what if instead you chose to learn from your past, no matter how traumatic or horrible it is, and instead of moving away from negative emotions, to actually learn how to cope with them, to learn how to process them in a way that's not debilitating, but in a way that instead is uplifting. That's a very real possibility for you, and in future videos we'll get into how you can do that. But for now, if you guys have liked these videos, if they've blessed you in any way, I just ask you that you give them a like, and please send them to anyone that you feel like would also be encouraged by them. So I'll talk to you guys next week. Thank you. Hi, this is Peter Martin, and if you're watching this, that means that you just finished one of the videos that I made about my new book, Fellowship of Suffering, which is all about how trauma impacts us and how we can better heal from it through community and fellowship with one another. So if you want to watch some of the other videos from the series, you can go ahead and look at the playlist and check it out. I'm going to be releasing new videos in the coming weeks as I get closer and closer to hopefully the release date of my book, which might happen sometime next year. So thanks for watching, and please subscribe and like these videos and share them if they are a blessing to you.